Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. So, once again, Benedict Lecca, your friendly librarian. I'm thrilled that you all are here, and I want to welcome everyone, lots of new faces. We're thrilled to be working, first of all, with Rob Dimmick and Ray Rickman. And I'm supposed to introduce Rob Dimmick. He's a native Rhode Islander. No, I'm lying. That's not true. I think he's from Nebraska. But anyways, they do. I have a lot of respect for Ray Rickman and Rob Dimmick. They do really substantive, important work, and it's always a pleasure to work with them. We're going to do. I should mention real quick an exhibition on disappearing ink later in the fall on Black writers and publishing in Rhode Island. So Rob Dimmick is co-founder of Stages of Freedom, and he's a great guy, and he's doing important work. I won't go into all his many, he's got degrees and all that. We won't go into that. So, and we're thrilled and very honored to have, of course, Dr. David Blight for a return lecture. So it's a big deal, and we're thrilled to have him. And now I'm going to pass it over to Rob Dimmick, who's back there.
Good afternoon. As Benedict said, I'm Rob Dimmick, co-founder along with Ray Rickman of Stages of Freedom. Patricia, I don't want you going anywhere. Before I make sort of formal introductions, it is such an honor to be at the Redwood. This is a gift to Stages of Freedom from Benedict and from Patricia. And Patricia has worked tirelessly to make this event happen. So Patricia Pettit, would you please come in? I have worked now on 3 separate occasions with Patricia, and she is a woman of conviction and detail and a true collaborator. And it's my honor to recognize the work that you've done to make this afternoon possible with these roses.
Oh, that's very
There are unsung heroes and heroines in our presence, and Patricia is one of them. And I think it's important that she be recognized for the work that she did to make this possible today. Benedict has a special place in our hearts as well. He has a similar vision to those of Ray's and mine, and that is essentially building the beloved community by telling stories. And the Redwood is a wonderful place to tell stories because it is filled with stories. And so it's my honor to recognize Benedict and the work that he's done to lift up and make public the work that Stages of Freedom does with Dr. Blight's Slave No More inscribed specifically to you, Benedict. Stages of Freedom has essentially 2 missions. Its first mission is to tell the story, particularly of Rhode Island African Americans. This is a deep, abiding, and extraordinary story that's unlike any other story in the country. And much of it is due to African Americans and Africans here in Newport. And so we are now the only Black museum in Rhode Island. You all get a card with that information on it. You also get a map that we co-produced on early Black history in Providence. Our second mission, which you are all supporting today, is our swim empowerment mission. And that is to teach African American children how to swim so they don't drown. And this has been a horrific summer with the loss of so many lives unnecessary. And so your purchase of a ticket today makes that work possible. And we can't thank you enough for supporting us and for being here today. And so please give yourselves a round of applause. I'm going to speak just in a little advance of Ray Rickman, who will introduce our guest of honor, but it's really important for you to recognize the amazing contribution that Dr. David Blight has made to our work. This is his third visit with us at Stages of Freedom, his second year at the Redwood, and then in 2020 on Zoom with over 1,000 people attending to talk about Frederick Douglass' presence in Rhode Island. And Frederick Douglass' presence in Rhode Island is groundbreaking. Frederick Douglass learns to be an orator here on Rhode Island as he traverses the state during the Dorr Rebellion, working for the rights of African American men to vote. And so we would like to honor Dr. Blight with a signed copy of Christian McBurney's Dark Voyage, British African Slave Trade, signed by Christian McBurney. And so in short fashion, it's my honor to introduce co-founder of Stages of Freedom, one of the most remarkable keepers of African American history in Rhode Island, Ray Rickman. Thank you.
So I'm going to give a short, long introduction and not a traditional one. And I made notes. Rob told me I didn't need any notes. I said, yes, I do. It's my pleasure to be at the Redwood again. Every time I come in this library, I go, wow, what a creation. Now, I belong to the Providence Athenæum, and so I have to pretend, but I'm not good at it. This is extraordinary, and I think people should recognize it. And thank you for your kindness, seriously. I believe from the bottom of my heart that every single person in this country should work on the racial divide, the racial discrimination, the lack of diversity. I was in a law office the other day, 100 employees, not a single Latino or black person, and that's Rhode Island. You're listening, and you know it. I know foundations that give away money and argue why they don't have to give to anybody black or brown, and the creator of that not the foundation, but of the funds that made that foundation possible, was involved in slavery. Are you listening? This is incredible, and we don't fix it. We don't fix it. And in the last 2 years, and I'm going to be brief because I got to start the introduction. In the last 2 years, if I hear one more institution or one more white person talk about Black Lives Matter, and there is no follow-up, no follow-up, I'm going to puke. I'm telling you how sick this is that we don't fix these problems because we have the capacity. We really do. And finally, this is part of the introduction, Dr. Blight is helping Yale look at itself and slavery and racism. And I told him in our little talk together just now about Georgetown embarrassing itself. It was saved by selling its slaves. And it said it's going to give reduced tuition to the descendants of slaves that they sold. So I'm calculating there are 5,000 such people, and 2 of them want to go to Georgetown, and they're going to spend something on them. They didn't think this out. It's an insult. It is a nasty insult to a school with billions of dollars in endowment because they sold black slaves to save the school. Are you listening? We must all do more. Every chance we get, we have to do what Benedict has just done. Come on in here and see if you can raise some money using this institution. Everybody has that power. Now, I like Dr. Blight a great deal. He and I are the same age. Do you know that? Now, you're the older man. You're
You just named how old you were in a certain year in Detroit. I know how old you are.
But now you're 5 months older than I am. And 5 months can make quite the difference. He came from Flint. Flint is one of those salt of the earth places. And I often think people are a certain way because of where they come from. Generally, they think who you are because of your mother. Every once in a while, your father. But I think you come from Detroit, you're a certain way, and you come from Flint, you're a certain way. And so I've always liked him. I read his first book 20 years before I met him. And I said, this man's from Flint. This has got to be good. And it was. The other fascinating thing about him, and you see this, you meet a scholar and you read his first book and you go, oh, this is good. And then you read his fifth book and you say, this is spectacular. Well, Dr. Blight's different. You read the first book, you say, this is spectacular. You read the second book, you say, this is spectacular. And no insult, but it doesn't get any better because it can't get any better. This is one of America's greatest scholars. And he is wedded to the material. And he is a teacher extraordinaire, writing books that are readable. Readable. I'm reading the Book of Pi right now. It's very difficult. The kids surviving. It is so difficult. And the only reason I can read it is because it's so well written. Otherwise, it hurts the heart, you have to put it aside. Now, when you write books about people like Frederick Douglass, you want people to read from page 1 to the last page, and so you need a scholar who can write. A scholar who can keep you, who tells you secrets. He just told me a secret upstairs. Just unbelievable secret. And I could put it under work because it deals with water and staying alive. The great Frederick Douglass. Let me get personal for a second, and then I will conclude. What I like about people is when they do something, and they do it. They don't do it a little bit. They're daughters of Girl Scouts, and they do Girl Scouts. I'm a girl, I'm helping Girl Scouts, and they sell some cookies. I like people who do something. And they do it 7 years or 27 years, and you can see the results. You really can. So in 2018, I was invited, thrilled, to go to the African Meeting House in Boston to receive the Frederick Douglass Award from the National Parks Association. And they gave it to me. They gave it to me for 40 years of crusading in the shadow of Douglas. 40 years. Now, I'd like to do that. I'd like to, go do it. Never mind this Girl Scout cookies once a year for 7 years and then never again. So they saw what I'd done and they gave me this award. And I was just excited, took the whole board, Rob went, we were just like, Frederick Douglass stood there in that spot, and I received an award. But that wasn't the most exciting thing. Sounds like it doesn't. Guess who else received that award that night? David Blight. And they gave it to him for 40 plus years of explaining what being an abolitionist means, explaining what being an advocate means, explaining black history. 40 years, never stopping, never, going off to write about cars. None of that stuff. This is one of the greatest scholars in America. Every day of my life, I get up and I say, today, something fabulously wonderful will happen to enrich my soul. And I cheat. On the way to work, I go to the Michael Van Leesten Bridge and I sit there all by myself at 5:45. Nobody's there, Judge, except me. It's my bridge. And sometimes I talk to Michael, and sometimes I don't. But off I go to work, and I've had this 5, 6, 7 perfect, wonderful minutes. The world has not done me any harm. They're not trying to run me off the road or anything stupid. There's no radio to listen about you-know-who or whatever. Just me, sometimes. Today I said my time is going to be when I take 6, 7 minutes to talk about David Blight. Now I'll put that in my journal, that this was my moment. This is my moment. This is the push-up to make me feel good about talking about someone who is one of the heroes in this nation. And I am so glad that God made it possible for me to be in the world at the same time as David Blight. Please welcome.
You've all known Ray long enough that you probably only believe half of it. Here's to Detroit and to Flint. Yeah, you know, we're all where we're from, to some extent. I had the good fortune to grow up in Flint when we had good water, good schools, a booming economy, the second Detroit. And that's all right. Happens every time. And I had parents who didn't get a college education, but by God, they were sure their 2 sons would. I want to come back to that in a second, but first of all, thank you to Benedict, Patricia, Rob, everyone who invited me here. It's my second time at the Redwood. This is, I just want to hide in here, you know, have food delivered, stay all night. I know that's not allowed. I actually do have this more than a fantasy that if we ever knew the world was probably going to end, it's not. Not anytime real soon. We should just all gather in libraries. There probably aren't enough of them, but we should just all gather in libraries. Have an open bar, open stacks. That drives you crazy, I know. Maybe not the stuff behind the wire. And just go down with the center of civilization, where we collected ourselves. That's a crazy fantasy, but why not? Libraries. Okay, I'm going to talk about Douglas today. Okay. So I need to, as they say in radio, kiss the mic. Okay. Is that all right now in the back? Good. How many of you were here the last time I spoke at the Redwood? Okay, good. That helps me talk about what I'm going to talk about, because most of you weren't here. But I want to start today with what's got me so angry. Sorry, but there's a lot of anger in America, but the task of anger is to convert it to something. I am appalled at what is happening in education, especially the attacks on, and this to Douglas very shortly, the attacks on teachers, the attacks on public schools, frankly, the idiocy of the so-called critical race theory issue in public education. This fall at the center I direct at Yale, the Gilbert Lehrman Center, we're devoting our annual conference, a 2.5-day conference, to the subject of teaching.
Uh-oh, turn it on.
There we go, it's back on. Careful what you touch. Teaching race and slavery in the American classroom. We're showcasing teachers, as well as scholars in the education field and history, but actually 3 entire sessions with teachers from all corners of the country. It's difficult to get teachers to come right now from Florida because they're scared, literally scared, to speak out in public. Just today, some of you may have seen this last night, MSNBC ran a segment of, what's her name, the new, Alex Wagner, or Wagner?
Yeah.
She did a segment last night on Florida, on Governor DeSantis's efforts to control classroom teaching, and civics education, and so on and so on. And the way they illustrate it online, if you look it up, they show a photograph of a map of the Atlantic slave trade, which has been blown up into a poster by the DeSantis, I guess, education department. That map was made by my center. It's part of the Atlas of the African Slave Trade that we published about 10 years ago. That's where they got that map. There are 250 maps in that book, and they were all converted to an online source called voyages.com. Those maps were prepared by a brilliant cartographer in Wisconsin. They show geographically and demographically the history of the Atlantic slave trade as it had never been shown before. DeSantis' education people took that map. It happens to be the map that shows that 2/3 of the Atlantic slave trade went to the Americas south of the equator. That's a fact. Another major portion went to the Caribbean, and only a thin line of close to 400,000 Africans went to North America. Well, that's all factual, and we can verify that very well. DeSantis' government decided to use that as a way of showing that slavery just wasn't that significant in North America. It just wasn't that important. I don't know what else to say except to just say that, and I won't quote the tweet I put out today about that. I put out 2 tweets today. I have found, I hate Twitter, but I do use it occasionally for certain purposes. But I find that when I send out a tweet about teaching and about teachers, I get huge responses right now. If I say something untoward about Trump, that's so boring. I mean, everybody does that. That's not interesting. So I don't do that anymore. But education is the reason I'm here. It's the reason most of us are here. It's the reason this is here. It is why you're supporting this program that Ray and Rob have created, trying to keep kids alive so they get educated. If it weren't for public schools and public universities, I wouldn't have an education. Flint Public Schools were terrific when I attended them. I can still name my history teachers who had great influence on me. And without 2 Big Ten universities, back when they were truly public universities, is how I got an education at all. In fact, the public school and the public university is, I think, arguably the most democratic institution the United States has ever created, if you think about its long-term influence. on the whole of the population. 85% of all students in higher education today are in a public university of some kind. Not in the great private universities and colleges that I happen to be privileged to teach in. I have no apologies for that. Yale is a great place to teach. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be there. I didn't come here to trash the Ivy League. I am directing and writing Yale's attempt to study and expose its own history with slavery. It's an extraordinary story. You've been involved with one of the founders of this library, Mr. Berkeley, who was an 18th century donor to Yale of both land and books. And yes, he owned slaves here, which was actually very common, as many of you know, in Rhode Island and even in Connecticut, or indeed in Connecticut. I'll just say one other thing about it. I just finished chapter 5 of what we're writing. I'm the writer, but I have an incredible, talented research team. It's now down to about 4 people. And Yale's story of its entanglements with slavery and eventually race and racism are a classic case of evidence hidden in plain sight. Almost all of our primary research, some of it's outside, but most of our primary research is right squarely in Yale's own archives. It has been there for 200 years and more. We are not writing a story to embarrass the university or to embarrass historical figures. We're not looking for every little moment or element of evil in the dark corners of a university's history. That's not the point of it at all. The point of it is self-knowledge. The point of it is to understand the 18th century in which a little college was formed in 1701 along the Long Island coast, and then moved over to New Haven in 1718. How it even got named for a guy named L.U. Yale, which is what's our story. But then how it grew, and what it became over time. And one of the things I've discovered in doing this research and writing is that all these names I walk by every day, the names on the residential colleges, the names on this building, the name on that building, all over the campus. I've never paid a lot of attention to who they are. I didn't go there. I don't carry a flag for one of the residential colleges. I wasn't a member of Timothy Dwight College, so most of the people who've been a member of Timothy Dwight College don't know anything about Timothy Dwight either. But now I know a lot about some of these people. And it turns out some of them are fascinating. They're truly interesting people. At the same time, the first 5 presidents of Yale were slaveholders. 2/3, roughly, of all the 18th century donors, rectors, presidents, and faculty were slaveholders. It sounds startling. I mean, it can't sound, like, oh, hush. Turns out that's a normative thing in Connecticut for a minister to own a slave or 2. Jonathan Edwards owned probably 2 slaves through almost all of his adult life. The great Jonathan Edwards. He's still Jonathan Edwards. But he had a blind spot. He thought the Atlantic slave trade was a terrible thing. But the Africans who were living in Connecticut, actually, he came over to Newport to buy his slaves. Jonathan Edwards bought his slaves here in Newport. He's still the man who wrote Freedom of the Will. And many, many, many other great theological texts, love him or hate him. His legacy is there forever. But he came here to buy slaves. Once they were here, he determined in his mind that enslaving them was for their benefit. and betterment and improvement. The Atlantic slave trade was horrible, evil, ungodly. But enslaving people was not. Turns out that's not unusual either. It's just how normative these ideas and practices were that we're trying to uncover. A last point about that, since Ray brought it up, I wasn't going to talk about it, but I didn't want to leave it hanging there. Almost all the other universities that have done this, and there are dozens now that have done this, studied their paths with slavery, have issued reports. Now, nothing against that, and some have been extraordinary reports with analysis of this and analysis of that. We decided early on, actually this was my idea, and then you come up with an idea, you gotta fulfill it. You gotta damn well do it. I said, let's not do a report, let's write a real narrative history, like a real book that people might actually read. Reports get thrown on shelves and their taglines that come out of them, the statistics come out of them. The press is always interested in questions of money. I said, let's just write a real history. So that's what we're doing. Of a university that's 320 years old and has kept its records. Well, we wish there were even more records. Historians always wish there were more records of everything. We are now up to well over 200 names of enslaved people. Sometimes only first names. Well over 200 in just the 18th century alone, who were owned by, again, Yale rectors, professors, presidents, donors, etc., etc. We have interesting ideas floating around already about where all those names will someday appear around here. I have a lot of ideas about that. I'm not on that committee. So. I'm just writing the book. And then I want to get back to the book I really want to write. All right, Douglas and education. Well, first of all, I should say, especially since most of you weren't here last time, this book would not exist, this biography of Douglas, which has been so kind to me, had I not encountered a great collection of Frederick Douglass manuscripts. Some of you may know this story because you've heard me tell it. But very briefly, it's now at least 15 years ago, could be 16 now. I had written my first book on Douglas. Ray, I still remember you interviewing me for your radio program about my first book on Douglas. You even made me read a part of it and then defend it. I mean, that was a tough interview. And by the way, I go anywhere Ray asks me to go, so that's one of the reasons I'm here today. I had done a book on Douglas already as my dissertation. I had edited editions of his first two autobiographies. I'd written lots of essays on Douglas. Douglas was a part of essentially every other book I've ever written. Somewhere, I would use Douglas. But I had Douglas out of my life. I mean, really gone. I don't think about Douglas anymore. Until I went to Savannah, Georgia, about 15, 16 years ago, to give a talk on Douglas's autobiography to middle and high school teachers, which I've done many, many times. I love doing that, because they were teaching it. And my host there was the director of the Georgia Historical Society, which was right up the street. And he said, there's a local collector here, a local gentleman, he'd like to meet you, and maybe we can have lunch. I must have said something like, okay, sure. And we did, and his name was and is Walter Evans. Walter owns one of those big, beautiful brownstones, 4-story brownstones in Savannah. You know Savannah at all? It's just 2 blocks off Forsyth Street on Jones Street. Walter grew up in segregated Savannah. He's African American. He came north for his higher education, Howard University as an undergraduate. Went to the University of Michigan Medical School, and then became a surgeon in Detroit for about 35 years, a general surgeon. He did very well, but very early in his life as a physician, he started collecting, especially art. And he has one of the finest private collections of African American art anywhere in the world. And he has, in fact, seeded other collections. And as I was telling Benedict earlier, his dining room is surrounded by at least 5 Duncans. But then he started collecting manuscripts as well. And you know how a lot of you are probably collectors. Collectors are eccentric and quirky, but Walter started collecting African American rare books and manuscripts. And his house is absolutely chock full of a first edition of any book you can think of or dream up that an African American ever wrote. They're all over the house. And all over the house are archive boxes. He has everything in proper archive boxes. They're even in the TV room. There's even some over in the corner of the kitchen. They're everywhere. And he took me over to his house that day. He got out on his dining room table a portion of his Frederick collection. And it was one of those, I don't know what else to call it. It was an oh my God moment. I did not on the spot decide, oh, now I'm going to write a biography of a full life of Douglas. No, it took months and months and months for me to get up the courage. But once I saw this material, especially the core of it, which was, there is, 10 huge Douglas family scrapbooks, kept principally by 2 of his sons. His daughter Rosetta had a hand in it too, but it was mostly kept by his sons over the last 35 years of their father's life. He also has enormous family papers, letters, photographs, a lot of manuscripts of speeches that are available other ways, but he has the originals. But the scrapbooks are truly priceless. Well, no, they're not priceless. Finally, the Beinecke Library gave them a price he would take. Long story short, I spent probably 6 or 7 Yale spring breaks in Savannah. I would stay up the street at a B&B, and eventually I got an even cheaper motel. I spent all day and some evenings in Walter and Linda Evans' house working on their dining room table. It is the greatest, no offense to the Redwood, archive I've ever worked in, for a lot of reasons. They only had 2 rules for me. One was don't come before 8 a.m., which was fine. And the other was never put your coffee cup on the same table with the documents. And I didn't, but Linda always had the coffee on it. It didn't get any better. And I went back for some weeks and summers and so on and so on. One thing led to another, and I found myself writing a full cradle-to-grave life of Douglas because of that collection. It took a lot of years and a lot of effort and a lot of wooing, but finally, Walter's a smart businessman. He waited until the book came out. He didn't take the first offers from any libraries. He had other offers. Emory wanted it, so did the Library of Congress, so on and so on. But the Beinecke, the great Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, made him an initial offer. No way. He's his own assessor, which is a problem for collectors. But after the book came out, the Beinecke made another offer, and he took it. And the month right before the pandemic broke out, it was in February of 20, Walter would not allow the Beinecke's very professional curators and people to come down to Savannah, load it up and move it. He brought it himself in a rented van, delivered it to a loading dock at Yale, and I was there to meet him. And he got the largest price the Beinecke has ever paid for an American writer's private papers, which is saying something, because they own the papers of, we'd be here all night if we started naming the kinds of writers, papers they own. digitized, including scrapbooks, which can't be easy to digitize. The things are hard to even work with. But it's all digitized, it's all on the Binding website, and the whole world can know. Now, I wanted that collection to be right there at the Binding, 1 block from my office, 8 years ago. But he wouldn't take that price. What did I learn from all that? A million things. Douglas is the third of Douglas's life is 30 years or so after the Civil War. He doesn't die till 1895. It's the period of his life when we haven't known as much about him, or he didn't seem as interesting. He was the aging Douglas, the old man, maybe falling out of touch, the old patriarch, the old radical, kind of out of touch with the next generation. Writes a third autobiography that's not a big success, blah, blah, blah. Douglas has always been so noted, if he's noted at all, for his young, heroic life. The man who spent 20 years, the boy who spent 20 years as a slave, escapes from slavery, writes that magical first little autobiography, which takes the world by storm, becomes this extraordinary, incomparable orator in his 20s and 30s, and then in the middle of the Civil War, when he's only in his 40s, he becomes the kind of advisor to Abraham Lincoln, although his advice wasn't always taken. But that older Douglas, people just didn't know much about. Well, the Evans collection is almost entirely the last third of Douglas's life. That's when the sons kept the scrapbooks. Everywhere their father went, clippings came back. The family hired a clipping service. I didn't even know clipping services existed in the 1870s and 1880s. They did. And there are newspaper clippings in these scrapbooks from everywhere Douglas went. And as a biographer and a writer, what you get from that, of course, is texture. You get anecdote. You get stories. You get reactions that happened in Kokomo, Indiana, or Iowa City, Iowa, or the hundreds and hundreds of other places Douglas spoke on his constant, ubiquitous lecture tours. So, I was able to develop that last third of Douglas's life as never before. And there are all kinds of discoveries or elements of the aging. It turns out, maybe it's because I'm aging so much, but aging can be fascinating. And this man struggled with that too. All right, but education. I want to come back to that for a moment, just a moment. Douglas, of course, was an American we celebrate for his genius, for his extraordinary writing. In fact, I call him in this book over and over, I call him the prose poet of American democracy. I don't think he has, he's got a few rivals for that. Walt Whitman is the poet, if you like, of American democracy. Abraham Lincoln has some claim to being a prose poet, without a question. So does Emerson, God knows. But as a writer who delivered a sustained prose analysis and critique and eloquent representation of this thing we call democracy, which we're now hearing about every day in every way. Is our democracy surviving? What is democracy? Why is democracy so fragile? Why is race so persistent in this society? Why can't we ever solve it? No one delivered that kind of analysis in millions of words quite like Douglas did. He did it in 1,200 pages of autobiography. If you're a biographer, never trust somebody who writes 1,200 pages of autobiography. He's playing a trick on you on every page. And you have to learn to read, under it and over it and the side doors and no. He's always there imposing himself on you. In fact, my crazy fantasy has always been to get Douglas in a seminar or a locked. He can't, no bathroom breaks, he can't move. And I just get to have to ask him all of the things he never said a word about in the autobiography. And every time I sort of have him there, he just vanishes. He won't stay. I got a lot of questions for him. Mr. Douglas, why is there only one mention in 1,200 pages of your wife, Anna? In fact, the way I'm going to ask that question of him is, Mr. Douglas, Anna, discuss. One of those final exam questions. And then it's going to go from there. Mr. Douglas, what does a man say to his 19 and 21-year-old sons when he recruits them into the Union Army in 1863 to go fight in a war where they could not only be killed or die of disease, but they can be enslaved if they're captured? What did you say to them? Because you never told us. You just said you were proud of them. No. What did you say to them? Did they go to war for you or for themselves? He's not going to answer that one either. And I got hundreds more. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of short-form political editorials. He mastered the short-form essay of a journalist. He was a great journalist. Edited his own newspaper for 16 years, and then edited a second newspaper during Reconstruction called the New National Era for 3 years. And then the speeches. Perhaps he's most famous for his oratory and his speeches. Today it's the 4th of July speech, which thousands, if not millions, of Americans now read on the 4th of July and all kinds of civic events across the country, which is it's wonderful, spectacular. And often the full text of that speech is not short. It's a 26-page, text. You got to give it some time to get through Douglas's 4th of July speech, but you'll be rewarded. It's the rhetorical masterpiece of American abolitionism. It's one of the rhetorical masterpieces in all of American letters. He also wrote some poetry, real verse. It's actually a good thing he kept most of that in a drawer. It wasn't his best form. His poetry was in prose. And you all know writers like this. There are poets who write in verse. My next book is going to be on James Weldon Johnson, who was a master poet and a technician. James Weldon Johnson was into meter and technique. And he gets all these young poets writing to him, wanting him to read their poems, and they think he's going to, honor them and help them get them published. He frequently writes back to the 17-year-old poet and says, I think you need another walk of life. No. He'll sometimes be nicer and say, you haven't quite reached the sensibility yet. That's pretty brutal. Or he'll say, of your 5 poems, one of them has possibilities. Poetry's poetry. It's hard. Douglas tried his hand quite frequently at real verse, and he loved the English Romantic poets. His literary influences, he had many, but was first the Bible, without a question. The Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets were his first source of language, of cadence, of getting prose in his head. It's the King James prose that first got in his head and it never got out. But then it was Shakespeare. He owned 3 complete Shakespeare. He owned 3 collections of the complete Shakespeare. And then there were the Romantic poets, Robert Burns especially. And you love or hate Robbie Burns. Today you can get people on both sides of that. Douglas was nuts over Robert Burns. He did a pilgrimage to Ayr when he was in Scotland. And he met Burns' daughter. Oh my God, he waxed on and on about that. And Douglas used to love to get up and read some Burns in front of audiences, and he would try out his Scottish accent, which was probably not that good. Those were, I mean, there were plenty of other influences. He loved Dickens. I mean, everybody in the 19th century loved Dickens. So, he's a prose poet. How does one become a prose poet like this? With absolutely no education. Not a day of his life in a schoolroom. Not a day in college. You know, if anyone could ever say, as Malcolm X is said to have said, you know, books were my alma mater, for Douglas, books were his alma mater, but so was life. But you can rest assured that he wishes he'd been in real schools. He wished he'd been in colleges. He said once, quote, "There never was a self-educated man who, with the same exertion, would not have been better educated better educated by the aid of schools and colleges." Okay, I'm self-educated. Fine, go ahead and celebrate that about me if you would. But I wish I'd gone to Yale. Although he had some really kind of fairly derogatory things to say about Yale boys a couple of times. You probably met a few of them on the train while going through New Haven. No Providence. Douglas's education came from life. I know that's a cliche, but it came from experience. It came from being a slave boy on the White House plantation when he's 6 and 7 years old. It came from learning about loss when he can only vaguely remember the last time he saw his mother. He can only vaguely, well, he can actually really remember the time his grandmother Betsy dropped him off at the White House, the last time he would ever see her. And he writes with extraordinary eloquence about nature when he was a boy, when he's trying to recreate experiences in his autobiographies of his life as a slave child. He remembers standing under trees at the White House in mornings, and then he'd see these huge flocks of blackbirds up in the trees. And there would be, he'd suddenly realize, you know, there might be hundreds of them, and they're actually silent. Until suddenly they fly, and they make this huge noise. And he writes about how he would always kind of dream that he would be on their wings. He would use nature to cultivate imagination. I've had the privilege of staying at the White House now, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. The owners have become very good friends. The people who own it, he is the 5th generation direct descendant of Colonel Lloyd, who owned it in the 1820s and 30s when Douglas was there. And they've adopted Douglas finally. They've acknowledged that Frederick Douglas is the most important person who ever lived there. And he lived there for 2 years as a slave child. They've remodeled the old kitchen house where little Fred actually lived. He slept in a crawl space next to the fireplace. The original fireplace is still there. And so is the crawl space. But around it, they've remodeled it into a really nice upscale apartment. And I get to sleep in that same room. I mean, so a few other people. Well, one morning I walked out, quiet spring day, and I hear birds here and there. And I went under one of those huge old trees, and there they were, the blackbirds. And it was just one of the many moments when I realized he didn't make that up. That's not just a metaphor. Well, it's a metaphor because he's a writer. But he saw those blackbirds, because I just saw them. Education, though, for Douglas also became the people he met. If he met you, he'd figure out what he can learn from you. And I think he started doing that as a child. In fact, I know he did. He certainly did in Baltimore. He spends 9 of his 20 years as a slave in the city of Baltimore, a city, a great maritime port. He works in the shipyards. He works in the docks. He learns certain maritime trades. He learns from the streets. He learns from the free black community of Baltimore, which is much larger than the slave population. He learns from preachers in 4 different churches. If Douglass met you, he'd try to figure out, especially when he becomes an adult, what you can teach him. And he had a problem keeping friendships. That had a lot to do with, I mean, I can't know for sure how to explain all of that, but that had a lot to do with just the insecurity of his background and how he grew up. He didn't always trust people. But when he thought he'd learned what he can learn from you, he might just discard you. I don't need you anymore. You've taught me what you know. Now I'll move on to her. He sought out highly educated people who also sought him out. He met every great abolitionist, every great reformer in Great Britain, in Scotland, in Ireland. He met people of all classes. And he learned with time, it wasn't easy at first, to swallow his past, get over his insecurity, beat them at their own game. He had an extraordinary gift with language, which wasn't just, natural from his mother's womb. None of this. Well, there is nature and nurture. We know that. And that debate probably will go on forever. But this kid had a gift for words. It's clear he had it when he was a child. It's clear it was cultivated when he was a child, particularly when he got to Baltimore by his mistress, Sophia Hall, who teaches him his alphabet for more than a year, reads out loud with him constantly, reads from the Bible out loud with him. He claimed the first book of the Bible he heard her reading to him. Who knows what was first? But he claimed it was the book of Job. Now, why would you read the book of Job to an 8-year-old? I mean, good God. He's going to identify with Job, for God's sake. I don't know. He loved quoting from Job later. He understood eventually the story of Job was one of the great tragedies ever written. And Douglass had a sense of tragedy. But education to Douglass was however you could get it. He was a sponge. And then he read like crazy. He started to collect books, but he didn't have any money at first. He eventually had people help him develop his book collection, which grew to thousands. And today, the National Park Service has most of Douglass's books in a warehouse out in Landover, Maryland, where they keep their treasures. There's a huge warehouse in Landover, Maryland, where the National Park Service has national treasures. And in an accordion, those accordion shelves, you push a button and they move back and forth. They have Douglass's book collection. I was so thrilled when they took me out there, allowed me to go there. And I thought, yeah, I'm gonna get to check out the annotations. He didn't annotate. Like actually most 19th century people. Books were so precious. I mean, today I underline the newspaper in the morning. I might need that quote, I can use that somewhere. I do it all the time. I underline magazines. It's crazy. I even have color coding in my underline. He didn't annotate much at all. I wanted to see one of his Shakespeare. I wanted to see if he annotated Hamlet. I wanted to know if he had scratched in. But he didn't. But what I did find, oh my God, he had interpreter's guides to individual books of the Old Testament. He owned 3 different guides to the book of Isaiah, which was his favorite book of all the Hebrew prophets. Not without good reason. It's the longest book in the Bible. There were at least 2, maybe 3 Isaiahs. There's almost no major Douglass speech that doesn't have either a paraphrase or a quote from Isaiah. Now, our man is consulting his books. creates on the page. This didn't all just come out of. And by the way, education, learning to write, the writing part came hard. At first, he was not a good writer. I mean, who of us are? I was a horrible writer. I mean, I got butchered by a couple of my professors, even as an undergraduate. They should have paid more attention. But when I got to graduate school, I almost bought a ticket home. Seriously. In my first seminar, Paul Compton, great historian of American intellectual history, gave me back my first paper in my PhD program with a C-, which is a ticket home. If you can't stay with C-. I had written this, I don't know, kind of far-out critique of John Locke's second treatise. I thought I don't know what I was doing. He handed it back all scratched up and said something like, Mr. Blight, this is atrocious. That's the way Compton was. He just recently died. Brilliant, unbelievable man. And he said, but if you rewrite it, I'll regret it. Took me about 6 weeks, 5 of those weeks to get up the courage, and the other week to rewrite it. Put an A- on it. Woo! I can stay in grad school. Writing is extremely hard. But eventually for Douglas, he had help. He had people, he had mentors. They weren't professors, they were abolitionists. Several of them. One of the most important was an English woman named Julia Griffiths, who became his, in effect, his assistant editor on his newspaper. She came and lived with the Douglas family for 6 years, from 1849 to 1855. But he read and read and read. In fact, Julia was instrumental in helping him build his book collection. Her name is stamped in one of those books. Long story there. But education. Douglas, every chance he got, would stress this idea of the significance and the power and the illumination of education, especially after emancipation, especially for the free people. There were schools created in his name. One of the first was a place called, it didn't last that long, but it was a place called the Douglas Institute, which was created in Baltimore, where he had escaped from. It was created in the summer of 1865. He goes back to Baltimore. That's not the first time he was there, but almost. He goes back to Baltimore to dedicate it, and he gives this glorious speech about the meaning of education, and the illumination of a young mind, and what that can mean. And he reflects while he's there on how his education began in these streets around Fells Point, where he spent his youth as an enslaved boy. I could go to great extents about Douglas and education. I want to leave that aside, except to say that it was a kind of a tragedy, in a way, in his family life. His 4 surviving adult children, they had a 5th, of course, Annie, who died at age 11 of diphtheria epidemic in 1860. His wife's namesake. But his 4 surviving adult children, Louis, the oldest, and then Charles, Frederick Jr., the oldest boy, and then Rosetta, the oldest of all, his daughter, all had a high school education in Rochester, New York, once they moved up there. But none ever went to college. And sometimes people ask about that. Well, for one thing, his sons wanted to make money. And they learned that from their dad, too. Did they ever? Owned some property, put some money up. He preached at them. Be self-reliant if you can. But also, all 3 of them got caught up in the Civil War. 2 of them enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. One of them, Louis, the oldest, got horribly wounded in the groin, as they like to say, which is why he never had children. And he almost didn't survive. He convalesced he was wounded at the Battle of Fort Wagner, the famous assault at Fort Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts. Louis came out of that badly wounded, but he stayed at the front for a month and got gangrene. Anyway, survived and convalesced in the New York hospital. The brother Charles was in the 54th, but was constantly ridden with disease. He stayed in the Army about a year and a half, mustered out in late 64. And then Frederick Jr. Became enlisted to be a recruiter of black soldiers, and he went actually down to the Mississippi Valley. He went into the Deep South, the largest, densest black population in the country, to recruit black soldiers. So by 1865, these kids were all veterans of the war. And the idea of going to college, first of all, they didn't have a lot of options as young black men. Very few options. But they wanted to make a living. And they wanted to get married and have families. And two of them went west. They went to Colorado. They went to Denver. And they opened up groceries and other kinds of businesses. In fact, believe it or not, folks, some of the scrapbooks in the Evans collection are books, are huge account books that the two boys had used for their grocery out in Colorado. They had started these books as account books in the first few pages. And they kept them. It was huge things. It was huge. They kept them, brought them back, each of them, converted them into scrapbooks. His daughter Rosetta had the best education of all. He even hired tutors for her on a couple of occasions. Tried to get her to go to some kind of higher ed in the late 1850s. She was the oldest. She was born in 40. But Rosetta, and they even had a governess at one point. Rosetta was trying to work with a lady and all of that. And Rosetta resented it, greatly resented it. And then the war came. And what did she do? She married a soldier, a guy named Nathan Sprague, a former fugitive slave, good-looking kid. Oh, God, look at the photo of him in the book. He's a knockout. But he was a total ne'er-do-well, a total jerk. And I mean that advisedly. But it was not a good marriage. But she managed to have 6 babies with Nathan over about a 9 or 10 year period. And that's essentially what happened to Rosetta's life. Rosetta was well educated. Rosetta wrote beautiful letters to her father. Rosetta later wrote a beautiful reminiscence about her mother. Rosetta probably wrote a lot of other things that don't quite survive. And we can't fully know what her ambitions may have been that got kind of crushed in having all these, all daughters, by the way. Douglas and his wife Anna had 21 grandchildren. But what Douglas eventually does for some of those grandkids is he pays for them to go to what were called normal schools in the South. These were the beginnings of colleges. And by the mid to late 1880s and into the 90s, he dies in 95, he's paying the tuition for at least 3 or 4 of his granddaughters who are in schools in Virginia, one's in North Carolina, because he wants them to have education. And his favorite special grandson, the one who became the concert violinist, he paid for him to go to the New England Conservatory of Music, and he did indeed become a very fine violinist. And there are a number of photographs of Douglas with that grandson. I have one in the book. They're both holding their violins. The grandson was much better on his fiddle than the old man was on his. So education to Douglas was almost a mystical possession. And how could it be otherwise? He never got to go to any school. The other thing I want to stress is a speech he gave in the text that we have was in 1869, but I believe he wrote it probably 1867. And the long and short of it is this. It's a speech. It's not one of his most famous speeches, although I've been trying to make it more famous. In fact, the New York Historical Society has now done a whole exhibition based on it. It's called The Composite Nation, or Composite Nationality. Sometimes it goes by that name. The context is interesting. It's Reconstruction. He writes this in the high moment of Reconstruction. He starts writing this piece in 67. It's right after the passage of the 14th Amendment, Equality Before Law Amendment. The 13th Amendment's already in law. Reconstruction Acts are coming out of Congress, left and right. It looks like emancipation is now turning into equality in the United States Constitution. And soon, it'll be the Voting Rights Amendment. Halfway measure as it was, Douglas found it to be a kind of barely acceptable compromise, but nevertheless, he first takes the Composite Nation speech on the road in 1869, the year the 15th Amendment was passed. This is a moment for Douglas that was probably the most hopeful, sanguine, I don't know what else you want to call it, enthusiastic time of his life. Now, he was thrilled at the time of emancipation. He was thrilled when the war came to an end, although not when Lincoln was shot. But his sensibility in 1867, 68, and 69 was his belief was that the United States was remaking itself. That it was experiencing a true second founding in the three great Civil War amendments out of emancipation and those Reconstruction Acts. The Composite Nation speech begins with him appealing to, look at the title, appealing to how the United States now has a possibility, he says, of doing something no people in all of history had ever done. And that was to bring all peoples of the earth into one nation and all live under the same constitution with equality before law. He says, imagine it. It's never happened before. We had the chance to do this. So let's do it. He even offers a frankly beautiful definition of what a nation actually is. And I love this definition, particularly now when we're constantly talking about the perils of our democracy. He says, a nation, quote, implies a willing surrender and subjection of individual aims and ends, often narrow and selfish, to the broader and better ones that arise out of society as a whole. It is both a sign and a result of civilization. What's a nation? Or what's a democracy? Well, it's that entity where all of us give up something that is important individually so that a whole can be created and that the whole will work. That's as good a definition of a nation as I've ever read. It's full of this kind of hope that America is on the cusp of actually doing this. Then he goes on to argue that a nation is also its story. He's a great storyteller. He says, look, we are our story. And what story can we now tell? We just reinvented ourselves in a ghastly, horrific civil war, but look at the possibilities that have come out of it. By freeing 4 million black people from slavery, we have the possibility to free all of us. He calls the United States the most fortunate of nations, quote, at the beginning of our ascent. God, you read this and think, whoa, what happened to that old Douglas? What happened to that angry, radical Douglas? Who is this guy? Because back before the war, especially when he came back from Britain, oh my God. When he came back from England in 1847, he's been over there for about 19 months. He's got this incredible flowering. He He's lionized in Ireland, Scotland, and England. They love him. He flirted with the idea of never coming back to America. He comes back to America, an angry young black man who has experienced a place where racism still existed in the British Isles, but nothing like it did in the hot house of racism in America. He comes back to America, and he goes out on the circuit in 47, and he says things like, "I have no love for America as such. I have no patriotism. I have no country. America hates me, and I hate it back." Woo! You know. He goes on and on and on. He says, "The institutions of this country do not know me, do not recognize me as a man except as a piece of property." And that became kind of the opening lines of his speech. The great Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, took him aside at one point on this particular speaking tour and said that there's a letter. It's a letter. So I shouldn't say he just took him aside. Where he says to Douglas, he said, "Fred, can you tone it down a bit? You're going to lose the audience here. You can't just hate your country all the time." I don't know what Douglas's response to that was. Probably was, "Yes, I can." So it's not that Douglas anymore. He believes the United States has a possibility here of becoming a nation of justice. Now, in the middle of the speech, he stops, and for the next 5-6 pages of the text, he makes an aggressive argument for Chinese immigration, which was just then becoming a big issue in the West, through California. The Chinese were coming. They were being employed on the building of railroads, the transcontinentals. It's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. The first Chinese Exclusion Act will actually be passed in 1874. That was the one against women. The final big Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't passed until 1882, but it's a big brewing issue in the country. Douglas makes this eloquent case for let them come, in fact, welcome them. He goes into how Chinese civilization is ancient. They're thousands of years old. They've done things we haven't imagined. They've written things we haven't imagined. Yes, they speak an alien language. Yes, they have strange and alien religions. But he uses an assimilation model. Classic American move. He says, but they will adopt our creeds. And he recites the creeds of the Declaration of Independence. He said, look, they will assimilate. Our creeds will draw everyone. Let them come. And then he employs nature, which he always did in this speech. They're coming over the rivers. They're coming over the hills. They're coming over, which is exactly what some of his audiences didn't want to hear. They're coming over the mountains. They're coming to America. Get ready. I mean, it's an amazing, particularly today, you read it today with all the fuss we have over the borders and immigration. And then he ends the speech. Classic move. He did a lot of speeches this way, including his last great one on lynching. He ends with this fulsome, robust embrace of the natural rights tradition. The classic kind of Enlightenment natural rights tradition out of which Jefferson drew the first principles of the Declaration of Independence. The right to life and liberty. The right to the doctrine of consent. The right to the right of revolution. That's in the Declaration of Independence too. You don't know his name, that one. And he says, our creeds are fine. It's the same thing he said in the 4th of July speech. It's our practices that matter. And he says, we have the chance to be the world's first composite nation. Today we'd probably use a word like pluralism or multiculturalism. In fact, the speech at times reads almost like a multiculturalism manifesto from the 1990s. Every school system had to have its multiculturalism statement. Or it reads a lot like all the new university mission statements. We are from all corners of the earth. We are global. We are everybody. We are the people. And just look at our view book. We have people from every part of the world, and they're all smiling. And look at all these colors. And they're not all football players. he's serious. I find no example of him ever giving this speech again after about 1872. You should know what happened in Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is not over in 1872. It's not even totally over in 1876. But this speech just doesn't fit anymore. And by the middle of the 1870s, where Reconstruction is falling apart, is eroding. It's being defeated, frankly, by terror and violence and the Southern Democratic Party and its revival across the 7 states. But it's interesting to look at this kind of window in time where for Douglass, the circumstances produced this kind of rhetoric and belief. He also, by the way, I shouldn't mention this speech without saying that in that period, and this actually lasted. Ray and I were talking earlier about when Douglass went to Haiti in 1889 as U.S. Minister to Haiti. Douglass became a kind of, today we call him a soft imperialist. He thought America ought to export these new ideas. The 14th Amendment ought to be exported, ought to be taken to Haiti and Santo Domingo and Venezuela and Nicaragua and all over the basin of the Caribbean and maybe South America too, and who knows, perhaps to Africa. Although you may wish it otherwise, Douglass never had a deeply serious interest in Africa. He was very interested in the Caribbean. But he thought we ought to start exporting this. These are great ideas. Let's take it to other people, especially those peoples still mired in forms of bondage, oppression, slavery. They need us. Now, we have a history since then that makes us a little suspicious of that kind of thinking sometimes. We've always got all the right ideas for everybody, just waiting for them to ask. But he really believed that. And it's kind of how he got on President Grant's commission to Santo Domingo, which means what today is the Dominican Republic. As he wasn't a member of the 5 members of the commission, he was their secretary. Actually took one of his sons on that trip. It was about a 2-month voyage down to the DR, Santo Domingo. They met with everybody. It was for the purpose of annexing Santo Domingo by the United States, or at least giving them our good ideas. So, this is a complicated man. I'll leave you with this. 1,000 ways I could leave you. But one of my favorite little passages by Douglass, and I have hundreds, is the last sentence of his long-form masterpiece, his second autobiography, not as widely read as the first, but My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, 10 years after the first autobiography, the long autobiography, written when he's 37 years old, much more political autobiography. He's become a political abolitionist by then, a believer in the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, a believer in the possible uses of violence against slavery, a believer in political action, political parties. It's 440 pages. It's brilliant prose. He's really become a polished writer by 1855. But when he ends it, and I just, I've always wondered, there's Douglass sitting there in Rochester trying to decide, how am I going to end this? You know, a lot of you are writers, beginnings and endings, right? It's the way I feel about a lecture in my classes. If I got my beginning together and I got my ending together, the whole middle will take care of itself. Doesn't always work that way. But, last line, I'll paraphrase. I'll miss some piece of the quote, but the paraphrase is, as long as heaven allows me to do this work, I will do it with my pen, my voice, and my vote. My pen, my voice, my vote. And what I've always liked about that is that that's about all most of us have. Some should give it to Ray's organization. But most of us, at the end of the day, have a voice and vote. Most of us don't really have the pen. We're not all writers. It's voice, it's pen, it's vote. In one of my summer institutes with teachers a few years ago, I guess I must have trotted out that quote on the first night of the institute. So I don't know, I made a big deal of it or something. By Thursday of that week, all the teachers showed up with t-shirts. And it said, Douglas in 2020. And on the back it said, my pen, my voice, my vote. He was running in 2020. You didn't know that. I used to go to lectures with that t-shirt. I don't do that anymore, but anyway. Thank you very much, and a welcome questions. That's a good trick, I like that.
Okay, whoever wants to be the young person.
Young people are looking at their shoes.
Go teacher.
Yes, sir.
Would you say a little bit about Douglas in Rhode Island and in Newport? He's spent quite a bit of time here. Did he come to the Redwood, for example? One would think so.
I don't know that he was ever at the Redwood, but Benedict will find out for us. As many associate, Rhode Island in particular, he spoke in Rhode Island dozens and dozens of times after his escape, but on his escape. I remember the last time I spoke here, I did a lot on this. I didn't even bring those notes this time, but he escaped through Newport. His escape route out of Baltimore was 3 trains, 3 boats, steamboats, and then finally a little skiff across the Hudson River into New York. But then, after he left New York, and he decided to come up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where David Ruggles and others in New York had said, get yourself to New Bedford. It's a safe haven of the sort for fugitive slaves. You'll find work there, you got all these maritime skills. Get to New Bedford. So he and Anna took a boat up here out of the East River in New York to Newport. From Newport, they took a carriage north and east down to New Bedford. I don't believe they stayed overnight in Newport, but I'd have to go back and check on that. There were many other meetings and associations with Newport. You mentioned the Door War. Yeah, he was a big voice in that so-called Door War in the 1840s. He also, he spoke endless times to the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society, especially in the early years, in the 40s, when he lived up in Lynn. When he goes out to Rochester, Rhode Island was the last on his circuit, because now he lived way in western New York. But he still came back here as a lecturer. One of the things you encounter with Douglas, especially if you do research on him, but also just understanding him, is the ubiquity of these lecture tours. It's just back-breaking, mind-numbing schedules, night after night, day after day, usually 2 and 3 months at a time. In the early years, they were like little troops of traveling, it was like Mother Love's Traveling Salvation Show. They'd go into a town and hope that some church would let them speak. But after the Civil War, part of the way Douglas made a living was going on 3-month lecture tours, almost always in the winter, especially out in the Midwest, because that's when the farmers could come to speeches, to chautauquas, to city halls and churches. And he would speak on an average of every other day at $100 or $150 a pop and try to get his expenses paid. He would go home from a lecture tour with as much as $3,000, sometimes $4,000, which was very significant. I know that's not about Rhode Island, sorry. But one of the reasons he had to keep doing that is that that entire extended family, I mentioned 4 surviving adult children, 21 grandchildren, were all financially dependent on him.
We also know that his best friend here in Newport is Isaac Rice. The Rice House is we believe, the longest occupied by African American family in America. It's on John Street. Also, if you send me an email at stagesoffreedom@AOL.com, I'll send you the link to John Rice, descendant of Isaac Rice's talk, done here at Redwood on Zoom, and it begins with a really remarkable video that we put together of touchstones of Douglas here in Rhode Island. It is an extraordinary journey and a long-lasting one with many friends and many associations.
He would have stayed at that house, because that's how he put himself up.
And who's next? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to point out that he also was very close to women suffragists in Rhode Island. And he came in 1868, he was what we would call the keynote speaker at the formation of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, which was the first, well, I think it was the second state association in the country that was formed. And he also was a big speaker at a gala event that they had in 1882 at the Rhode Island State House. So he was active not only with the abolitionists and anti-slavery people in the state, but also with the women's suffragists as well.
He had many deep associations with women suffragists from Seneca Falls on. He was at the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, the only black abolitionist male there. He also had, of course, famous disputes and squabbles in 1869 and 70 over the 15th Amendment. Susan Athenæum, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a few others. A terrible breakup indeed with Stanton over the fact that the 15th Amendment did not include women. That wasn't Douglas's fault, but the criticism of Douglas took on a frankly racist form from some of these dear friends of his, and it caused permanent damage to some of those friendships. Although he had reconciliations with almost all of them, especially Susan B. Anthony. Yeah, he spoke at endless women's suffrage and women's rights gatherings all over the country.
Do we have our last question?
Yes, sir.
Could you talk just really quickly about his negotiations with Haitians over the Mont St. Nicholas? Because I just found that really fascinating, him trying to defend Haiti, yet carry out the mission.
He was in an impossible position. He goes to Haiti as U.S. Minister in 1889. He was the third African American to be U.S. ambassador. The first was Ebenezer Bassett, a man from New Haven, Connecticut, who later becomes a very close friend of Douglas. The second was John Mercer Langston. So Douglas is appointed by President Harrison, the second Harrison, in '89. And the primary aim of U.S. policy at that point was to get control of Mont St. Nicholas, which is a beautiful bay, beautiful bay up on the north coast of Haiti. The purpose was to get it as a coaling station for the United States Navy and as a port for American maritime trade. I don't think Douglas fully understood that before he went. He didn't exactly do his homework. Not that he wasn't a good diplomat, but I will say this. Once he arrives and he begins to realize from his correspondence with Secretary of State Blaine, James G. Blaine, that this is what it's about, it became a serious problem for him. And he has a fast learning curve from the Haitians, that the Haitians weren't giving up any land, period. A bay, an island, nothing. They don't give up land. They had a history of I had a difficult history with this. Now, he stays longer than some people wanted him to. He had critics on both sides back in the States. Tremendous press coverage of this, especially in the New York City papers. Douglas should never support this policy. He should never do this, never do that. Then there was the racist attacks on him. If we had a white diplomat in Port-au-Prince, we'd pull this off. Eventually, what made it untenable for him was when, I forget how many, 3 or 4 U.S. warships arrived in the harbor of Port-au-Prince. And the negotiation from Old San Nicolas was taken over by an admiral. Now here's the coolest thing though about that, doing that, we have a whole chapter on this in the book, but Douglas's correspondence with Blaine and others in the State Department, he learned how to write in that classic diplomatese, that very formal, affected language, which at least in the 19th century, I can't believe they're still writing this way now in dispatches, you know, from, anybody been in the diplomatic corps? Oh, okay. But he'd write this very formalistic language about policy, about this, about that. And then the same day, he would sometimes write a letter to his son Louis or his daughter Rosetta and tell him what he really thinks about what he's doing. I mean, that was priceless. You know, and sometimes those letters are really literally on the same day. And you can see his commitment to this situation falling to pieces. He finally resigned after 2 years. Came home in 1891. He also wasn't in the best of health while he was there, and the climate was tough on him, to say the least. There's a great photograph I have in the book of Douglas sitting in Port-au-Prince at his desk, white mane of hair, he's writing something, and he looks like he's just wilting. You know. Also, they experienced a violent, brutal coup d'etat while he was there. He had to turn his residence into a kind of hiding place for all sorts of fugitives. So it was a hell of an experience, but a lesson in trying to enact a foreign policy for your government that you don't believe in.
So can I tell everybody who has, I was saying it earlier, and I'll say it again, I read this book twice. And I read it the first time.
That's heroic. Anybody?
I read it for kind of scholarly enjoyment. And then I went back to make notes. You know, like when you read James Baldwin, you have to make notes. You can't read Baldwin without notes. And I went back and I made about 35 notes in this book. And what you were just talking about was kind of my favorite section, because I just read Secretary Blaine's 2-volume whatever. I wanted to see what he said.
Wow, I don't know if anybody wrote about Blaine anymore.
Oh, yeah, no, 2 volumes.
You read?
Yeah, anyway, this is one of the most fabulous books. You can still go order it. It's still in print. It's new. It is a Pulitzer award-winning book, and I urge you, you know, you come to a book party and there are no books to buy. I urge you to go up the street there in Middletown and read this book. Thank you.